Dr. Anthony Fauci has advised 7 presidents, usually behind the scenes, but Dr. Fauci, for better or worse, became the public face of the government's response to the COVID epidemic. In his new book, On Call, The Doctor's Journey in Public Service, Dr. Fauci recounts the rather mercurial relationship with former President Trump during that crisis. That chapter is titled, He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not. CNN's chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, was able to sit down with Dr. Fauci to get his side of all this, his proudest achievement, I think, in the book, and what his legacy could be. Yeah. Sanjay, you sat down with him, you had this conversation. I noticed the Brooklyn really came out of him a couple of times as you were interviewing him. What did you hear that stood out?
Well, you know, I've interviewed him so many times over the past couple of decades, and always it's in the throes of something, right? Anthrax or Zika or Ebola, H1N1. People don't realize that he's really been present for all these things. But as you mentioned, HIV/AIDS, going back to the early 80s, was sort of the beginning, and COVID at the end. And I really wanted him to talk about the similarities between those two things. I don't think many people who sort of know you from COVID realize that in many ways you went through some of these same challenges before with HIV/AIDS, not just new disease, trying to find new therapeutics, but the activists. Right. What was that part of your life like?
It just is very different because the activists were trying to get the attention of the authorities, the scientific authorities and the regulatory authorities, that the time-proven way of approaching the development of interventions for a new disease doesn't work well for a disease that's rapidly killing themselves and their friends and their loved ones. So my interaction and my response to them, as I often get asked, is dramatically different than someone on the basis of no evidence accuses you of killing people, or that scene of Marjorie Taylor Greene at the hearing. I mean, come on. That is nothing like what the activists were doing.
You know, it's curious. That epidemic was terrifying to this country and around the world. But how did he deal with the sort of that very difficult intersection of politics and science? We just heard him mention Marjorie Taylor Greene. The first year of the pandemic, people were coming for him the first, second, and even today.
Yeah, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that he's worked for 7 presidents. I'm not sure there's anybody else in history who has done that. So he has this really interesting perspective on these different leadership styles and how people handle crises, especially public health crises in his case, but just really interesting. But I think that intersection between politics and science, I mean, it's something, as you're alluding to, Sarah, that the world, certainly the country, has seen laid bare over the past couple of years. But it's been ongoing for some time. But I think this was a particularly challenging time for him and President Trump. And I asked him specifically about the beginning, March 2020, how he was sort of handling things at that point. And he talks about a specific instance. You talk about this interesting press briefing that you did. This is in March of 2020. And you had to correct the record, even if the president was talking. And first of all, how challenging is it?
I said to myself, I have a responsibility to preserve my own personal integrity and a responsibility to the American public, regardless of what administration. I've been responsible to the American public when I first came here half a century ago, and I'm responsible to the American public now. So when I walked up to the podium, I said, here it goes. Dr. Fauci, the president just said that hydroxychloroquine is, the end all. And I'll say, no, I'm really sorry, but that's anecdotal, and there's no information that it actually works. That was painful to me to have to do that, but there was no doubt that I had to do it. I mean, it wasn't like, well, maybe you shouldn't, maybe you shouldn't. There was no doubt that I had to do it.
You may remember those images, Sarah, where Dr. Fauci's at the lectern and President Trump is sort of right over his shoulder, sort of glowering down at him. What was interesting in the book, which I thought was interesting, was that we sort of got a behind the scenes then of what happened next. So then they leave the briefing room, they go in. Dr. Fauci thinks he's going to get yelled at by the president. That doesn't happen. Instead, what the president does, he takes him into this little anteroom off the Oval Office, and he looks at the TV screens, and he looks at Fauci, and he says, will you get a load of these ratings? These ratings are incredible. So I think the country was thinking that there was this huge friction between President Trump and Dr. Fauci that really wasn't there. In fact, at that point, at least early on in the pandemic, the idea was, hey, this is generating a lot of interest from the American people.
Oof, the ratings thing, though, with hundreds of thousands of people, dying, is hard to hear. Did Dr. Fauci? I know you asked him this question. Did you ask him, hey, you going to retire anytime soon?
Right. No, I asked him that, and I'll tell you, you'll listen to what he says, but he's lived in the same house since 1977. I mean, this guy has been sort of a stable sort of fixture, not only in public health academia, but I think in his own private life as well. 1977, married to Christine Grady, who's a bioethicist at the NIH. He is now a distinguished professor at Georgetown. He's still going. He just became a grandfather, but we talked about this.
Yeah.
Are you ever going to retire, you think, or?
Sanjay, that's a good question. When I decided to step down from the NIH, I said, I want to write my memoir, but I want to do it at a time when I'm, energetic, passionate, and still healthy and feel good. And then after that, I want to continue to contribute in a way where I still think I'm making a contribution. And right now, I may be 83, but I feel like I'm 55. So to me, I don't see any end to it. But I do know that I think I have enough realism about myself. I mean, the people who throw darts at me, think badly of me. But I'm fundamentally a pretty humble person, and I know and can evaluate my limitations. And I can tell you when I feel I'm not able to leave it all on the court, then I'll walk off the court.
It's interesting, Sarah, just as a little bit of a side note, he is 83 years old. We're talking a lot about age, over the past couple of years. He's a very sharp guy, just wrote a 450-page book, that memoir. So, and you hear him, you hear how sharp he is. 20% of the book roughly is about COVID. 80% is about all these other things that have happened over the last nearly 60 years in public health. So pretty incredible read. I read the whole thing. You learn a lot about public health. You learn a lot about the man.
Yeah, and seared into my memory, Dr. Gupta, is when you were the first person to say this is a pandemic. And I remember that moment, thinking that our world is about to change. Thank you so much. I know the interview is really good, and we'll get to hear a lot more of it. I appreciate it, Dr. Gupta.